Good evening and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our class on the Katha Upanishad. Om Namo Brahma Dibhyo Brahma Vidya Sampradaya Kartribhyo Vamsharshibhyo Mahadbhyo Namo Gurubhyaha Om Shanti 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 Narayanam Padma Bhuvam Vasishtam Shaktim cha Tatputra Parasharam cha Vyasam Sukham Gaudapadam Mohantam Govinda Yogindra Mathasya Shishyam Shri Shankaracharya Mathasya Padma Param cha Hastamalakan cha Shishyam Tantra Thotakam Vartikakara Manyan Asmad Gurun Santatamanatosmi Om Shanti 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 Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om. We salute the long line of teachers of the knowledge of Brahman, beginning with the Supreme Reality itself, who gave this knowledge to Brahma, the Creator, who in turn gave it to the first sages, who passed it down in a long line of continuous succession from teacher to disciple until the present day. To all of them, our profound salutations. May that reality protect us. May it sustain us. May we grow strength together. May our study be vigorous and illuminating. May there be no ill will amongst us. Om, peace, peace, peace be unto us all. So tonight we will take up where we left off last time in the Katha Upanishad, and I believe that tonight will bring the Upanishad to a conclusion. There are 8 verses left, but really 7 of them that need some commentary. So let us see. But we are to begin on chapter 6, verse 11. So let me read the last 2 verses we did in English, 9 and 10. 9 says, his form, that is Brahman's form or its form, his form is not within the field of vision. It can't be seen. None can see him with the eyes. He is revealed by the intuition of the intellect, which resides in the heart and controls the mind. Those who know him become immortal. And so then verse 10 says, when the 5 senses of perception lie still with the mind and the self, even when the intellect works not, that is the supreme state, they say. So when the 5 senses have become still, they're no longer working, they're not functioning, they have, not because they're injured, not because they are suppressed, but because they are withdrawn back into the mind. The sense powers, not the physical organs, the physical receptors, but the sense powers are mental faculties. And so when those faculties are withdrawn into the mind, and the mind itself is silenced, and the intellect, the highest part of the mind, works not. That is, it no longer functions, because it too has become perfectly still, then that is the supreme state. So as I explained last time, when the mind and senses are completely stilled, including even the highest part of the mind, the intellect or the intuitive faculty, the buddhi, then the mind itself dissolves back into its source, which is the Atman, the true self, which is one with Brahman, one with the cosmic reality. So the mind is its activity. And when there's absolutely no activity in the mind, then the mind itself disappears. Again, it's not destroyed, though sometimes in some Vedantic works, they will talk about the destruction of the mind. The Yoga Vashishta, a great Advaitic text, a very long Advaitic text, 24,000 verses. In English translation, it comes to 4 very large volumes. So there it says one of the paths to illumination is manonasha, destruction of the mind. But destruction of the mind means here simply the mind dissolving back into its source, which is the self, which is why Sri Ramakrishna used to say that the pure mind or manas, the pure buddhi or intuitive faculty, intellect, and the pure self are the same thing. When the mind becomes perfectly pure, it dissolves into the intellect, which when it is perfectly pure, dissolves into the self. So the mind is nothing but its activity. And when activity ceases, the mind itself ceases. And that which is beyond mind and all mentality, that remains. So then we come to verse 11, which continues this thought. Verse 11 says, Tam yogamiti manyante stiramindriyadharanam apramatastara bhavati yogo hi prabhavapyayo. So tam yogam iti manyante. So that is known as yoga, that is called yoga, stiram indriya dharanam, with the firm control of the senses, when the senses are held in firm control, meaning such firm control that the functions of the senses have stopped. So yoga, as is well known, Patanjali says in the Yoga Sutras that yoga's chitta vritti nirodha, that yoga is the cessation of the activities of the mind. And so here it's starting from the senses and saying that yoga is when the senses are under complete control, such control that they have been withdrawn from their objects and withdrawn into the mind. Apramatastara bhavati, yogo hi prabhavapyayo. Apramatastara bhavati. So such a person at that time becomes freed from all carelessness, all inattentiveness of mind. In the Sanat Sujatiya, a small text from the Mahabharata. As you know, the Gita is from the Mahabharata, but in the Mahabharata there are many texts which have been taken out as separate texts. And so one of those is the Sanat Sujatiya. And in that, the great ancient sage, the perfected sage, one of the 7 primordial rishis, of whom Sri Ramakrishna said Swami Vivekananda was one, the original rishis at the beginning of creation. Sanat says that pramado vai mrityu, the carelessness is indeed death, which can be taken in 2 senses. The figurative sense, which is the main meaning, that death is carelessness, unmindfulness. That when we are unmindful, we might as well be dead. We are as good as dead when we are not mindful, when the mind is not focused. As Swami Vivekananda once said, everything other than the complete control of the senses is nothing but the sowing of wild oats. You know the English saying, the sowing of wild oats. That is, just young people have so much energy and the vitality that just needs expression, and so they just waste that energy in useless pursuits, just out of the overexuberance of life energy flowing through them. So that's the sowing of wild oats, meaning it doesn't lead to anything good. It doesn't lead to any advancement. And so Swamiji said that anything other than the complete control of the senses is nothing but the sowing of wild oats. And so Sanat, the sage Sanat, says that mindlessness, carelessness itself is death, is as good as death. Another meaning of it is the literal meaning, and that is that we actually don't die until there's a moment of mindlessness. Just as we don't go to sleep until we become forgetful. That's why we never catch the moment when we actually go to sleep. No one can catch that moment when we fall asleep. If you try to catch it, you can't go to sleep. You stay awake. So what you find happens, even if you try to stay awake and catch that moment when you fall asleep, which I and some people have done as a practice, you find that as long as you maintain it, you can't go to sleep. That a time comes when the mind begins to wander and you become forgetful, and then somehow you fall asleep. But when and how, you never know. And so you fall asleep in a moment of forgetfulness. So with death. Death only happens when we become forgetful. As long as a person is attentive, they don't die. But when a time comes when they relax their hold on the attention to the outer world, and then they can die. That happens even with people in a sudden accident when suddenly they're killed. Then they are knocked into a state of carelessness or forgetfulness. But if we have a longer decline, then death comes at a moment when we become forgetful of the world, and then we lapse into death. So, tam yogam iti manyante stiram indriyadharanam. That is known as yoga, which is the firm control of the senses. Apramattastara bhavati. One at that time becomes fully mindful, because when the mind is not running out through the senses, the mind is established in itself. And that is the state of yoga, when the mind is established in itself, because then the mind is able to silence itself and withdraw into the Atman, into the self. Yogo hi prabhavapyayo. Because it says here, yoga can be attained and lost. One can attain to yoga and one can lose it also. And so it's necessary to become apramatta, not unmindful. One has to remain mindful because yoga can be lost. So yes, there is a state beyond which, or after which, yoga is never lost. There's a state of realization where one is freed forever, as the text here will say in a few verses. But until that state is attained, then yoga, relative attainment in yoga can be lost, can be attained, and it can also be lost. And so one has to remain without pramada, without heedlessness, without carelessness. So that's why in all spiritual traditions, they give great importance to mindfulness, being mindful, being careful, being attentive, and remaining on the path, because it's easy to slip away. So the running translation here says that firm control of the senses is known as yoga. So stiram indriyadharanam, that firm control of the senses, yoga miti manyante, that is known as yoga. Then the yogin becomes free from all vagaries of the mind. That is, all of the wanderings of the mind, all of the stream of consciousness of the mind, all of the noise of the mind, and which is all another word for the heedlessness of the mind, where the mind is just going on of its own, wandering and thinking of all sorts of things. So then the yogin having attained to yoga, which is the firm control of the senses, then the yogin becomes free from the vagaries of the mind. For yoga can be acquired and lost. So that's a warning that yoga can be acquired and lost. And so one is to practice attentiveness, attentive to one's thoughts, attentive to one's actions, attentive to the direction of one's mind, because that which has been gained in the spiritual path can also be lost. So Sri Krishna, of course, gives us the assurance in chapter 6 of the Gita that even if we fall from the path of yoga through carelessness, we fall from the path of yoga, that what we had attained will not be lost, that after we have the karmic experience of our fall from yoga, then we will come back again in another incarnation. We'll come back embodied again, reincarnate, and start from the point where we left off before we fell. And so nothing is permanently lost. But for this life, yes, we can fall from yoga and all that we had attained can be lost for the time being. And for this life, we're not able to make much more progress. Yes, people do make progress in this life after a fall sometimes. But in general, if we fall, we find that it takes a long time to get back to where we were. But in the next life, that will be once again our starting place. Once we have used up the karma that came from the fall. So then we come to verse 12, which says, Naiva vacha na manasa praptum shakyo na chakshusha astiti bruvato nyatra katham tarupalabhyate. So this says, Na eva vacha na manasa praptum shakyo na chakshusha. This meaning this state or Brahman, because Brahman is realized in the state where the mind and senses have become completely silent. So this state or this realization of Brahman, the same thing, cannot be attained by the speech, nor by mind, nor by the eyes. That is, the senses cannot sense it. It can't be seen. It can't be heard. It can't be felt. It can't be spoken of. It can't be thought of. And so it's beyond the senses, beyond speech, and beyond mind. So the Upanishads, several of the major Upanishads in several places affirm this same idea, that the reality cannot be attained by the speech nor by mind, and of course not by the senses. So that's what's being said here. And why can it not? Because reality is beyond all concepts. It's beyond all duality. It's beyond all ideas of subject and object. It's beyond all concepts of anything. It's beyond all possibility of seeing as an object. It's the eternal subject, the seer, the unseen seer. And so it can't be perceived because it's never an object. What do we see? What do we hear? We see an object. We hear a sound, which is another type of object. We smell a smell, which is another type of object. We feel something, we feel an object. Even if that object is part of our own body, we feel it as an object. So the senses deal only with objects. And the mind can only think about concepts, and concepts can only arise within the context of time, space, and causation. Desha, kala, nimitta in Sanskrit. It's time, space, and causation. That's what Kant showed, Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, showed in Western philosophy. That the Ding an sich, the reality, the thing in itself, is beyond time, space, and causation, but the mind can't perceive it because the mind only perceives things that come within the realm of time, occupy space, and are within the chain of causation. Otherwise, the mind can't understand anything beyond that web of time, space, and causation. So the mind can't think of it. It can't realize it as mind, because the reality doesn't fall within the conditions that the mind imposes on reality. And it can't be spoken of because speech also, like the mind, the speech is the language of the mind. Speech deals with subject and object. It deals with time, place, and circumstance. It deals with concepts. So if I say cow, I'm dealing with the concept I have of what a cow is. And so I can speak of concepts, I can think of concepts, but reality is outside of all mental conditioning. So naiva vacha na manasa praptum shakyo na chakshusha. It's not cannot be attained. It's incapable. Na shakyo. It's incapable of being attained. Praptum, by the speech, by mind, or by the senses. Astiti bruvato nyatra katham tarupalabhyate. So astiti bruvato anyatra. Anyatra, other than, anyatra, elsewhere than, or other than, asti iti bruvato. Those who say bruvato, those who say asti, it is. Other than those who say that reality is, katham tarupalabhyate, how are we to attain it? How are we to understand it? How can we comprehend it? Other than going to those who say, asti, it is. So the idea here is that how can we, if it can't be spoken of, it can't be thought of, it can't be perceived, how are we to know that it is, other than going to those who say, asti, it is, it exists, because I have experienced it, those who can say that. Where else shall we learn of it but those who have had the experience of the truth? Because again, that's why in the Vedanta, well, let me start in a different way with a little more background. There are those Western philosophers who say that India has no true philosophy and that Advaita Vedanta is not a true philosophy because Shankara and other Vedantins start with the statements of the Upanishads. And so they define philosophy in such a way that it excludes systems like Vedanta. That's easy to do. Come up with a definition that excludes the people you don't want to include. But their reason for saying that Advaita Vedanta is not a philosophy is that their idea of philosophy is just pure thinking about reality, trying to figure things out without taking the help of any prior source, not taking a scriptural revelation or anything like that. I look at the universe, I think about it, I try to figure out what it is. But Vedanta says clearly that that will not lead to the truth. Because of this, the truth, Brahman, the reality, which is your own self, the Atman, Brahman is can never be an object of thought. You can't think about it. You can't speak of it. You can't perceive it. And so then if it's not subject to rational inquiry, how could you ever come to it? Vedanta says you can't through rational inquiry. It's only by going to those, astiti bruvato, it's only by going to those who say it is because I've realized it. So without revelation, without those who had perceived Brahman and their direct experience by transcending the mind and senses, then there's no other way to know that it exists. That's why with all of the scientific inquiry, we don't have any signs that Brahman exists. There's no scientific, every now and then you hear about the discovery of a God particle or something like that. Well, that's good for headlines, but it's silly, childish thinking about God and the spiritual reality. There isn't a God particle or a particle that proves the existence of God. Swamiji said that science and religion would one day shake hands, that is, that they would come to meet. But that would happen because science would, through its own inquiry, come to the limits of its own inquiry and see that we've come to the limit. We can't go any further with this inquiry into the physical universe. Now we have to go to the metaphysical in order to find the reality. And so science would lead to the point of its own transcendence. Again, the running translation here is, the self, the Atman, can never be reached by speech, nor by the eyes, nor even by the mind. How can it be realized other than from those who say it exists? So it's a beautiful and very pregnant verse, very pregnant with deep meaning, that the nature of reality is such. So what good does this do to us, or do for us? If we can't think of it, we can't speak of it, we can't see it, so what's the use? Well, for one thing, before I get to the direct actual usefulness of it, that's the reason why we have paths like the path of devotion, where God, the supreme reality, which is one with the self, the Atman that this is talking about, where God is objectified and made visible so that the mind has something to hold on to. And it's not an illusion. God is that reality. And so we're approaching that reality, but in a form revealed by the divine, which is approachable by us in a subject-object relationship. But as I have sometimes said, that object, the divine object, God, in a form of a deity or an incarnation or just God, God is a peculiar object, an object that is the ultimate subject. God is the soul of the soul, the heart of the heart, the innermost reality. And so we objectify it for the sake of spiritual practice, that which can never be objectified. And so by approaching that divine object, not like an ordinary object, something here in this world, but by approaching that divine object, we're approaching that which is the eternal subject. And eventually, when we come to God, we find God to be the innermost reality. So the other use, as I said, that's one usefulness, or that's one reason why we have the path of devotion, because it makes God approachable, so that the mind can think of God, but in a real way. It's not that God is made up, not that God is imagined. It's the actual revelation of the infinite in the form of deities and incarnations, which come to us as windows into the infinite, but living windows, they're not archetypes, they're not symbols, they are realities that reveal themselves to us as living windows into the living reality. So I said that there's a direct usefulness of this also. Once we understand this, that we can't think about it, we can't speak of it, we can't see it with the eyes, if we deal with that thought, or any of the thoughts in the tradition, any of the true revelations in the tradition, but say this one thought, if we deal with it, we begin to get a feeling for it. We begin to understand that, yes, the mind can understand it, the speech can't speak of it, the eyes can't see it. Because those are words, yes, and words can't contain it, but those words indicate something which is beyond the words themselves. And it's indicating a truth, a deep, real, realizable truth. And so once we understand what this is talking about, we begin to get a feeling for it. And then we have a basis for practice, even if we want to go in the direct way of the Upanishads, the direct inquiry into reality. And we begin to feel that, yes, this body isn't it. All of these objects, they're not it. Space and time, that's all not the reality. We begin to get a sense that there's something deeper, something more profound than all of this. We begin to get a deep sense, a feeling, and by feeling I don't mean a sentiment, an emotion, but a feeling, an intuition of a reality which transcends speech, transcends the mind, transcends the senses, transcends everything that we perceive. That becomes something that begins to become real for us. Even long before we have the direct experience of it, we begin to intuit it. So it has direct meaning for us if we want to follow the path of knowledge, the path of the reality itself. But it's also because of this, stated in this verse 12, that we have paths like the path of devotion or the path of Raja Yoga, the path of meditation, where the whole purpose of Raja Yoga is to present practices that we can do with our mind, our senses, our breath, etc., that we can do that prepares the mind for transcending itself. But it gives us things. We start with something physical to concentrate the mind on one pointedly. And then we go to something subtle, an idea, a concept, a word, a sacred word, and a visualized image, and then concentrate the mind on that. And then we go to even more subtle realities to concentrate on. So it gives us a graduated path to get to the point where we can go to the nameless, unthinkable, inconceivable reality. So whether directly by getting a feeling for what the text means, or indirectly by following bhakti or yoga, then this has deep meaning. So then we come to verse 13, which continues the idea. अस्तित्येवोपलब्धस्य तत्त्वभावेन चोभयोः अस्तित्येवोपलब्धस्य तत्त्वभावप्रसीदति. So this continues the idea in verse 12 where it says, Astiti bruvato nyatra katham tarupalabhyate. How could it be attained other than or comprehended other than by going to those who speak of it as it is, because I've realized it. So here it says, asti iti eva upalabdhavya tatvabhavena chobhayoho. So forget the chobhayo for, well, no, there are two ways of interpreting this, Shankaracharya's way and then Swami Sharavananda's way. In this case, I think Swami Sharavananda ji his interpretation is better even than Shankaracharya's, and so I'll give the two explanations. Here he says that asti iti eva upalabdhavya, that which is attained as, that which is comprehended as asti, it is, that which is attained as that is, tattva bhavena, in its reality. Well, here he takes cha ubhayoho first. So he says that of the two, ubhayoho means of the two. So he takes that first. So let me start over with his explanation. Shankaracharya sends ubhayoho to the next line, but Swami Sharavananda says ubhayoho of the two. What are the two? The two mean of asti or nasti. It is or it is not. There are those who say that Brahman is, there are those who say that there is no Brahman, like the Buddha and the Buddhists as his followers. They say that there is no reality, there is no self, there's no reality to the universe, there's no reality behind the universe, there's no reality behind the self. Realizing that there is no unity anywhere, there is no one reality anywhere to the individual or to the cosmos, that is enlightenment. And so they say that nastiti upalabdhavya. It should be attained as there is no self. So of the two, saying that there is Brahman or there is not Brahman, tattva bhavena, as the reality asti iti eva upalabdhavya. It is attained by those who know it in truth as the reality, asti, as that which exists. So of the two choices, it exists or it doesn't exist, because remember, Nachiketa asked at the beginning of the Upanishad, or actually comes at near the end of chapter 1, as his third boon. He asks, is there anything that survives death? When a person dies, some say that it continues, some say that there is nothing. Which of the two is true? And so here again, according to Swami Sarvananda, he's saying of these two that there is reality or there is no reality, which is the idea of the Buddhists and of the materialists. It's those who say that it is, who know it in truth, and they are the ones who have realized the truth. And then let me continue with his interpretation. Astityevo palabdhasya, the second line, tattvabhava prasidati. Of the one who realizes it as, or one who comprehends it as it is, the reality, tattva bhava, the highest truth, prasidati, is graceful. And here graceful means reveals itself. Prasada, the holy food we eat, offered food, is called prasada. Prasad means grace, because it's believed that food offered to God is touched by God and becomes a conveyor of blessings, a conveyor of grace. And so we eat prasad to purify the mind and body because it's full of grace. And so prasidati means is graceful, but is graceful means reveals itself. So his translation goes, of the two, it is or it is not. It is alone is to be realized as the statement, it exists, is alone to be realized as the reality. To him alone reveals the true, who realized it as being, as asti, as it exists. So of existence or non-existence, it's the existence which is the reality, which is realized by one who approaches it as such. And the truth reveals itself to the one who knows it as asti, as it is. So Shankaracharya says, and just in brief, he says that ubhayoho, of the two, it means that of Saguna Brahman and Nirguna Brahman, the reality with attributes, which we know as God, the personal God, or the absolute. And so it's the one who approaches the absolute as it is, and nothing more can be said of it, who realizes the reality in itself. But that, as Swami Sarvananda says, and I agree with him, that really doesn't, that's an uncalled for interpretation, because there's no discussion here of Saguna Brahman and Nirguna Brahman. Yama, the speaker in the Upanishad, says of these two as if it's something that's being discussed. And what is being discussed is asti and nasti. It is or it is not. And so that makes more sense, that it's saying that of these two, it is or it is not. It is the one who realizes it as it is, who attains to it in truth. And to the one who attains to that which is, the reality reveals itself to him. So again, that's the idea of grace, which is brought up twice in the Katha Upanishad. This one time here, and then in a previous chapter where it says, gosh, now I can't think of the verse. I know it by heart, but I can't think of it right now because this verse is is stuck in my mind. But the verse which says that that reality or the self is attained by one whom the self chooses, and to the one whom the self chooses, the self reveals itself. That is, we cannot attain to the self, because that would be the limited ego conquering the unlimited, which is beyond the ego, which is impossible. So what we can do as phenomenal beings, individual beings, is to purify ourselves through spiritual practice to the point where the reality reveals itself to us. But that comes as revelation. It comes not as I conquered the infinite. You can't conquer the infinite. The point comes where the other side has to reveal itself to you. So all you can do is to do spiritual practice to purify the mind and the heart until from the other side something is, the truth is revealed. And as Vedanta says, it will reveal itself to everyone in time. But we have to do the footwork to make ourselves susceptible to that revelation. As Sri Ramakrishna used to say, the wind of God's grace is always blowing, but we have to set our sails to catch the wind of grace. If we don't set our sails, we won't catch anything. So of the two, the being alone is to be realized, or it is alone is to be realized as reality. To him alone reveals the truth, who realizes it as it is, asti. Here in Shankara's commentary, though I haven't taken his interpretation of the word ubhayoho, of the two, he does have wonderful things to say, a very profound commentary on the nature of existence itself. He says that this talk of asti iti, it is, and that is the reality. He says that if we seek the source of this universe, the root of this universe, we see that everything is caused, and so we trace things back to their causes. And from a Vedantic as well as a Sankhya Yoga perspective, when we trace things to their causes, we get to subtler and subtler realities. Modern science is still dealing with causation at this level, but a time will come when they will see, as they're already seeing to some extent, that the universe, the more you inquire into it, the more it dissolves into subtlety. And so the world dealt with by the physicist, especially the theoretical physicist, is far different from the world that we perceive. This world, for the physicist, dissolves into greater and greater subtlety. But a time will come where it will go beyond even the physical and the conceptual. And so Shankaracharya says, the more we analyze the universe through the chain of causation, we go to subtler and subtler levels of existence until finally the only thing left to do is to go beyond the mind itself, into existence itself. So he says that existence itself is the most subtle of subtle realities and perceptions, and that is the root of everything. That his argument against those like the Buddhists and materialists who say that there is nothing behind this universe is that we see everything here is. Everything has existence. And yet it appears and then it disappears. As Buddha said, yes, everything here is momentary. It comes into being and then it disappears. And so it has the quality of existence, but it doesn't, it has no permanence. And so if we trace the sense of existence within things, we come to what existence itself is. That if the root of this universe, the source of this universe did not exist, then the universe itself would not exist, because nothing would have the quality of existence. So as I said, and as Shankaracharya points out, though I'm expanding a great deal on what he says, that everything here has existence, and yet we find that it just appears and disappears. So the existence doesn't belong to it. So where does the existence come from? So eventually we find that the asti, the isness of everything, is the borrowed existence of the root of the universe. And that, again, if that were not there, then if the root of the universe were non-existence, then nothing here would have existence. So, of the two, the being alone is to be realized. It is to be realized as reality. To him alone reveals the true, who realizes it as it is. And then we come to verse 14. Yada sarve pramuchyante kama yesya hridi shritaha atamartyo mrito bhavatyatra brahma samashnute nute. So yada sarve prabhidyante, yada sarve pramuchyante kama yesya hridi shritaha. When yada, when sarve kamaha, all of these desires, all of the desires, pramuchyante, are destroyed. It actually means are freed, meaning when we are freed from all desires. Which desires? Yesya hridishritaha, which are in this phenomenal person's heart, which are lodged in the heart of the individual, the jiva, each of us. So the desires which exist within each of us, which are lodged within us, when we are when all the desires within the heart are destroyed, atamartyo mrito bhavati. Then this very mortal becomes immortal. Not because we change into the immortal, but we realize that we were always immortal. Not as the body, not even as the mind. The body is always changing and dies within a few years. The mind continues from death to death, but it's always changing. And so when desires cease, then the mortal becomes immortal, because it's the mechanism of desire that keeps us seeking limited things, thinking that limited things will fulfill me, will make me happy, will be the source, the solution to all of my problems. But they never do. They never do. And so when all of the desires of the heart are destroyed, then the mortal becomes immortal. Atra Brahma samashnute. And here itself, one attains to experiences Brahman. So the mortal becomes immortal, and here itself, the person attains to Brahman, experiences Brahman. So when all of the desires of the heart are destroyed. So as I've said many times, and as Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda said, you can't just destroy desire. And so with ordinary desires, for ordinary things, just let them be. Don't try to fight with them. Just simplify your desires. Don't try, as modern society tries to get you to do. Don't amplify your desires and don't multiply them. Simplify your desires to just the basic things. But if you like certain food, Sri Ramakrishna says, well, go ahead and eat it, because if you frustrate yourself, then you may have to be born again just to eat something that you really wanted to eat. So don't torture yourself, but just simplify your desires. And but in time, if you increase your desire for God, or you increase your desire for self-realization, then the other desires become less and less until they're just instinctual desires which are not a bother. And the mind is freed until one comes to the state where no desire arises within the heart. That's what we seek, because if that happens, if we get to that, then we have attained to the goal. When no desire arises within the heart, then the mortal becomes immortal. That is, we realize our natural immortal nature, and we experience Brahman. So verse 15 says, continues the same thought, and says, Yada sarve prabhidyante hridayasya yeha grantayaha atamartyo mrito bhavatyev tavadhyanusa shasanam. So here it says that Yada sarve prabhidyante hridayasya yeha grantayaha. When all of the knots of the heart, hridayasya grantayaha, the knots of the heart, when all of them, prabhidyante, are cut asunder. When we cut through all of the knots of the heart, what are the knots of the heart? All of the complications that we have, all of the attachments, including the attachment to this body, the attachment to being an individual, the attachment to being important, all of the attachments that we have to everything in the world, including our own bodies and individuality. When all of those are cut asunder, atamartyo mrito bhavati, again the same statement, then here itself, the mortal becomes immortal. When the knots of the heart are cut asunder, the mortal becomes immortal. Etad hi anushasanam. This indeed is the instruction. So here he's giving emphasis to this, that this is the instruction, that when all of the complications of the heart, when all of the attachments of the heart are cut asunder, then here itself, the mortal becomes immortal. This indeed is the instruction. After my brahmacharya in India, after I'd finished the training center and had the vows of brahmacharya, in those days at Bellarmut, those who were taking the vows of brahmacharya and those who were taking the final vows of sannyasa, they took them on the same day at different times, but on the same in the middle of the night. But first the sannyasins and then the brahmacharyans. Nowadays they're on separate days, but it used to be on the same day. So after the ceremony, the new sannyasins and new brahmacharyans would travel to places around Calcutta, places of pilgrimage, including Jairambati and Kamarpukur. So we went together to Jairambati, Kamarpukur, among the other places. And we went to Swami Parameshwaranandaji, the great disciple of Holy Mother, who's mentioned a great deal in the texts on Holy Mother. He was very close to Mother, Kishori Maharaj. And so he was still alive at that time. So I still remember going and sitting on the floor in his room. He was lying on his bed because he was very advanced age and weak and not well. And so we went for his darshan to see him, to take his blessings as new sannyasins and brahmacharyans and to hear his advice. So one of the new sannyasins asked him, Maharaj, what was Holy Mother's central advice? And so this old Swami, who was lying down and looking very weak and very old, he raised himself up and said, Nirbhasanahau, be without desire. But he said it like a lion, and with such force that I've never forgotten that. He said the Holy Mother's main advice was, be without desire. So for the devotee, that's done through surrender. And for the jnani, it's done by realizing that why should I desire? I am the self, eternally fulfilled. It's my thought that I'm not fulfilled that makes me seek after external things. All I have to do is to realize who I am, and then I'll find that this pursuit is useless and it never led to any good. So either way. So that's what this is talking about. When the complications of the heart, the crookedness or the attachments of the heart. So that's why the devotee of Mother Kali, the spiritual devotee, not the one who worships Mother Kali for worldly benefit, but the spiritual devotee of Mother Kali asks her to dance her cremation dance within the heart, cutting all attachments within the heart. With her sword, may you, O Mother, dance within my heart and cut all of the knots of the heart, cut all of my attachments. So then we come to verse 16. Which says, Shatam chaika cha hridayasya nadyastasam murdhanam abhinisritaika tayordhvamayan amritatvameti vishwang anya utkramane bhavanti. So this speaks of the Shatam cha eka cha hridayasya nadi. There are 101 nadis, subtle channels of pranic energy, of the prana. You know the idea of the qi in acupuncture and the Chinese thought. So the same idea is in Hindu thought, that there are these channels of prana, that which Chinese call qi, we call prana. And so these channels are subtle, not perceived as yet by medical science, but they are real. And so there are 101 which come out of the heart. Tasam murdhanam abhinisrita eka. Of these, there is one which comes from the heart and goes to the top of the head. So of these 101 nadis, channels, psychic channels, one comes from the heart up to the top of the head. Taya urdhvam ayan amritatvameti. One who goes by that channel to the top of the head attains to immortality. Vishwanganya utkramane bhavanti. But there are various other paths that those who haven't attained to immortality follow. So the simple idea is that within the heart there are these nadis, these psychic channels, and one who has become highly spiritual in this life, then they leave at the time of death. They leave the body by this psychic nerve that goes from the heart up to the top of the head. And then they go to the realm of Brahmaloka, where in time they attain to illumination. Brahmaloka is the highest highly spiritual heaven where only highly spiritual people go. It's the heaven of the mystics of the world. It's where Ramakrishna Loka, the realm of Ramakrishna, is, where the heaven of Jesus, the heaven of the Amitabha Buddha is. The Kailasa, Vaikuntha, all of these spiritually heavenly worlds are manifestations of Brahmaloka. So one who at the time of death goes by this channel attains to Brahmaloka. And from there in time, one attains to full illumination. They never come back here. And others go by other nadis, and which lead to further rebirth, here or in other worlds. But they have to come back again. They're not finished with their karma. So the lucky one who travels by this nadi and leaves from the top of the head, then they attain to immortality. The idea is that one who is already Jivan Mukta, who has realized Brahman fully in this life, who is already liberated in life, they don't go anywhere. So when the body falls off, the body just falls off and they remain what they were. But one who hasn't gotten to the fullest illumination, but has led a spiritual life, goes by this nadi and goes out to the head. So like Swami Nikhilananda, when he passed away at Thousand Island Park, it was at the time of breakfast, and the devotees who were there with him were sitting around the table, and I know one of the people who was there present and saw it, Prabuddha Prana, one of the nuns of Saradamat, an American nun of Saradamat. She said that they said Brahmarpanam, and Swami Nikhilananda, who had been ill for a long time, suddenly his eyes went up to the Bhru Madhye, to the point between the eyebrows. His eyes went up like that, and he went into ecstasy and passed away. And so that is one who goes out through the top of the head. So 101 are the nerves of the heart. Of them, one has extended toward the crown of the head. Going upwards by it, one attains immortality, but others lead in departing differently. They go out through the other nadis. And then verse 17, 18 is just eulogy, and so that won't require much explanation. Let me just get 17, because there's not enough for another class, so I want to finish these two verses tonight. Angushtamatra purushontaraatma sada jananam hridaye sannivishtaha tam swacharirat pravrihin munjadive kishikam dhairyena tam vidyat shukram amritam iti. So this gives a thought which is common in the Upanishads, an important thought. Common doesn't mean it's unimportant, but it's something that is repeated in different Upanishads. Angushtamatra purusho antaratma sadajananam hridaye sannivishtaha. So the inner self, the real self, exists within the heart. Hridaye sannivishtaha. Sadajananam hridaye sannivishtaha. So the inner self is always seated within the heart of beings. Sada, always seated within the hearts of all beings. Jananam, of all beings. Angushtamatra purusho, and that self which is of the size of a thumb. That self which is of the size of a thumb, which is the inner self, is always seated within the heart of beings. So the idea here is that the self, of course, is beyond time and space. but is first perceived within the heart. So as long as we are aware of the body, there is a place within the body where we first perceive the self, and we perceive it as of the size of a thumb. So again, that's, don't take out a measuring stick and try to be precise about your measurement. No, this is said to be for the purposes of meditation, because a time comes when we see a divine light within the heart, which is roughly the size of the thumb. And so often when we meditate, or if we meditate on our Ishta within the heart, we meditate on them as of that size. Again, don't worry about that. You can measure, you can think of the Ishta as much bigger or whatever. But when the heart awakens, one sees a light within the heart. And so there is where we first encounter the self. But eventually we find, of course, that the body disappears and the self is infinite and it's beyond time and space. But as long as we're aware of the body, meaning as long as we have spatial sense, for the sake of meditation, we meditate on it as a light the size of a thumb within the heart. So it says here, the Purusha of the size of a thumb, the inner soul, dwells always in the heart of beings. Oh, and then the rest, of course. Tam swat shariram, tam swat sharirat, from one's own body. Pravrihain, one should take it out from one's own body. Munjad eva ishikam, dhairyena, with patience. One should separate it as one separates the pith of the munja grass. The munja grass is a grass which has a pith inside. You separate the outer blades of the grass, and the pith inside remains. Like those of you who know pampas grass, which grows with the pith inside, and then the blades come out like so. And so you separate those, and then you get the pith inside. So one should separate that self from the body as the central stalk from the rush grass. Know him to be the pure, the immortal, yea, the pure, the immortal. Tam vidyat, one should know him, chukram amritam. One should know him as the pure and the immortal. Tam vidyat chukram amritam iti. It's repeated again. One should know him as the pure and the immortal. This verse is interesting because Swami Atmarupananda, Latu Maharaj, who was unlettered, he couldn't read or write. He didn't know the alphabet. Sri Ramakrishna tried to teach him the alphabet and he couldn't get beyond the first letter. So he was literally illiterate. Not like Sri Ramakrishna, who could read and write but didn't do either one. Latu Maharaj was actually illiterate. So he was listening in his old age to someone reading this passage from the Katha Upanishad in a class in Benares. And when this verse was read, he said, yes, that's it. It's exactly like that. It's exactly like that. Meaning that he knew it from experience. He knew from experience that, yes, this inner self has to be separated from the body, like the pith of munja grass from the blades. Then we come to the last verse. Mrityu proktam nachiketo labdhva vidyametam yoga vidhim chakritsnam brahma prapto virajo bhud vimrityur anyopyevam yo vidhadhyatmameva. So mrityu proktam nachiketo labdhva. This which was told by death. This story, this Upanishad, which has been told by death to Nachiketa, this knowledge, vidyam, etam yoga vidhim chakristam, this whole knowledge about the process of yoga, which has been told to Nachiketa by death. Brahma prapto virajo bhud vimrityu anyo api evam yo vidadhati vivadhya atmameva. I'm sorry. Oh no, I see. vid. Okay. Anyo api evam yo vid adhyatmam eva. So, yeah, that makes sense. So, Nachiketas, having been instructed by death in this knowledge and in the whole of the process of yoga vidhim, the whole process of yoga vidhim krishnam, the whole process of yoga, and became free from all impurities and death. Brahma Prapto attained to Brahman, Virajo Abhut became pure, Vimrityu, and became freed from death. So Nachiketa, having been so instructed by death in this knowledge and in the whole process of yoga, became free from all impurities and death and attained to Brahman, Brahma Prapto. And so will it attain any other too, who knows thus the inner self. So anyo api evam yo vid. So anyone else also who knows what? Adhyatmameva. This science of the self, this knowledge of the self. So Nachiketa, who received this sacred knowledge from Mrityu, from Yama, from the Lord of Death, attained to Brahman, Brahma Prapto. He attained to Brahman, Virajo Abhud. He became pure, and he became immortal. And so then the promise of the Upanishad is that everyone else who does the same will attain to that same realization. So again, the idea of Vedanta is that everyone will one day or another attain to this blessed state of freedom. We may have to come back after we start our spiritual life. We may have to come back again a time or two or three, but in better and better circumstances. But eventually we're going to come back and attain to the highest state. And some who attain to some progress in this life may attain to enough progress that they're reborn in Brahmaloka, a highly spiritual world where there's just the tinge of space and time, but where everything is perceived as spiritual and full of divinity. Then we remain there in a state of blissful meditation for a long time, and then we attain to full illumination. So whether we have to come back again to work more, if we do, we'll come back in better circumstances, more propitious for attaining to spiritual realization. Or if we go far enough in this life, then even at the time of death, we can go to Brahmaloka by following this path to the top of the head and then attaining to what's called Krama Mukti, gradual illumination. So I've gone way over time, and I'm sorry for that. But I didn't want to leave just 2 verses left because that would not be enough for another class. But I also didn't want to rush the text. And so since this is our last class, I will see if there are any questions. Are there any? There are no questions. Okay, so there are no questions to answer. And so let me give announcements, and then I will say the closing prayer. So announcements are on Thursday, which will be our first class in December, the 2nd. We have the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna class as usual. On Sunday, I will speak on a Vedantic view of Jesus. And that's because, of course, Christmas is coming, but normally I would speak on the topic closer to Christmas. But it happens that in December 5th is the only Sunday service we will have. Because the next Sunday I will be giving a retreat, an online retreat, which we have announced and you know about. I'm not giving it through the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston, but through Omni Awareness, a group of devotees who are trying to get together programs on non-dualism. And so this is their first program. So I'll give a retreat on the Advaita Makaranda, a small Advaitic text, but a very beautiful text. So this weekend we'll have the talk. The following weekend I'll be giving the retreat Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, so I can't give this. And the next Sunday would be the 19th, which is so close to Christmas that our experience is usually people are so busy with Christmas family and gift buying and other things that there's not much attendance anyway. So this Sunday will be the last Sunday talk. But we will have classes up through, there'll be a couple of Upanishad classes, and then there will be, I think, there'll be 3 gospel classes in December. And then we'll have a Christmas service also. But all of that you'll be getting in the email, so I need not elaborate. So let me give a closing chant. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamada Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. That infinite being is full, perfect, and complete. This relative universe is filled with that same reality, full, perfect, and complete. From out of the fullness of that infinite being, the fullness of this universe has come, and yet that remains ever the same. Om, peace, peace, peace be unto us and to all the beings of the universe.